short and punchy, and please address them to a member of the panel. Any questions on crime? Okay, on the back.
My question is directed to Tim. Just on the charge rates, the stats that were released, why wasn't the conviction rates spoken about, and why wasn't racial profiling spoken about? Why wasn't there any context given to that?
The conviction rate was something we tried to find. We don't have access to that. We can't track the conviction rates. They are part of the court statistics. They don't relate to the arrest statistics. So we can't say, I'll arrest Tim Cartwright and then easily track that through. So we can't do the same numbers. One of the things we did do was compare, so if you like, adjust the figures for youth offending. So in any population, youth will offend more. Still came out with not as bad, but still over-representation of the African groups. While we didn't talk about profiling, that wasn't one of the conversations that the journalist was talking about. I talk about matters that are put to me, so it just wasn't discussed.
Karen, what's the ideal situation from your organisation as far as should these things be published? Is there evidence that they shouldn't be published because they can lead to scapegoating? What's your line on it?
Look, I think it's difficult because inevitably, as Tim said, sometimes this information will be published. I guess the issue, and part of it is how do those of us with an interest in this space make sure that the discourse around those statistics is complete and reflects the full story. I think the problem we all have, as both Tim and Burhan have alluded to, is that how the media uses this information is really difficult for all of us, which is not to get out from under, but certainly we had similar questions about conviction rates. I was having a conversation with someone last week in Noble Park who had been charged with hindering police, and I'm sorry, Tim, had been charged with hindering police 6 months ago. I was sending one of my legal officers down to court the next day to observe the hearing, and it was withdrawn at 3 o'clock that afternoon, the afternoon before the charges. That won't come out in the stats. So, you know, stats are useful, I guess, to some extent in pinpointing where the community needs to understand there is an issue, but I think it from a human rights perspective and from a discrimination law perspective, what's really important is that the rest of us understand that there are a whole range of factors that lead to that, and how do we make sure that those issues are well understood. In terms of collecting the stats, I guess there needs to be a sense of responsibility from the police about how they are used, and I know VicPol endeavoured to do that. At the same time, again, the day after those articles, we were contacted by a number of people in the community who had been directly targeted by fairly vicious emails at an individual level, telling them to go home, even though they'd been in the country for many, many years, because they were part of that community. So I think, you know, as Absalom said, coming from Sydney, I'm well aware of the issues that, you know, that were experienced by the Vietnamese community and by a whole range of communities. The Islander community at the moment in Western Sydney has probably got the same sort of experiences. But there really does need to be a lot of effort from the rest of us in that space to endeavour to ensure that the full picture is presented and that it's not just a bit of the picture.
Dr. Ahmed, you're getting very close to getting into politics. How can, just some suggestions for the police, how can the gaps be identified, the problem areas be identified without profiling these communities?
Well, look, first, what I've been talking in this campaign and the previous one is, as a community, we own the problems, but we don't own the solutions for our problems. When a community does not own their problem, their solution for their problems, they're always in tatters. And our communities are disempowered Empowering is not sitting and talking. Empowering is resourcing. Our problems are franchised to services, and the services have a stake for us to remain where we are. Now, what is the way for us and the police to work with us is, first, our community need to be empowered. We need to be resourced, not franchise our problems to services, and we and our communities always remain at the hands of services where they got to get their next funding. If we are going to move in this, we need partnership, and always been for us the egg or the chicken. They keep telling us you don't have a structure to fund you. If we don't get a resource to structure ourselves, we won't be structured. So existing services are always milking the system because they've got a structure. So forever we will not have a structure to stand on our feet. Now, these problems that we're facing, for me, are rooted from certain deficiencies of services that our community are facing. The police has to understand first, when approaching our communities, especially approaching families, we come here, most of us, under humanitarian. And I make it under humanitarian. And humanitarian does not stop at the airport. It should come right through the process. When we give in license for people to drive, we give them L plate, we give them P plate, and we give them full license. For people coming from a lawless system, from camps, from refugees, we're expecting them overnight to walk on streets of Melbourne as if it's a plain field that everyone understands the system. I have been over 25 years in this, and I am a senior lecturer and Swiss lecturer at Melbourne University. I don't understand the law. Imagine a mother comes with 3-4 kids, placed in housing commission, little kids growing, in every step they're followed, and little minor mistake ends up in a crime. And this is where we need an L plate for at least a year for people. We're not talking about here a crime that someone killing some. No, minor crimes. Like family having a child coming from school wanting to go to a nightclub, and mother says no. It's not crime. The police will not interfere into that and give the child a free license to walk on the street. Now, the police are creating the problems themselves than helping us. I have been witnessing myself in the last 7 to 8 years, young girls at the age of 15, 14, getting pregnant and having a child. These girls, for just little minor mistakes in the family, police interfered and gave the kids, the girls, a place to get out because it was considered as a child abuse. Now, what is child abuse in a civilized society like we call ourselves is different from someone coming from, say, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, Nigeria, whatever country, has a communal way of behavioral systems that we live in. That communal behavioral and social respect breaks straight away. And I heard a young mother, Sudanese mother, saying here in a forum organized in Fuscray sometime 3 years ago, she said, I was with my husband and with my kids when I was at refugee camp. I came here, I lost my husband and I lost my kids, but I got money. And that tells the whole story, because the system is not giving people room to move into this place. Yes, we are new. Yes, we need to learn, as everyone does. Our kids need freedom, but what freedom? Freedom has responsibility. We need to educate people before we throw the freedom into the street. We're losing, mothers are crying when they go into Flinders Street, seeing their kids, after 6 months, falling into drugs and alcohol. A mother lost because the police said, this is child abuse, and giving the child out of the house, and in 6 months, what happens? The girl gets pregnant, and the boy or the or the girl falls into wrong hands because it's a behavioral. At that teenage, we all passed it. Unlucky, I passed it back in where I got my community. If it was here, I would have been the same problem. So how do we work with police? We can work with police when police are prepared to understand. First, people coming from this communal background, they cannot just fit into institutional societies because they are women, because they are unemployed, because because in fact I take people from the CEO's corporate world to Footscray with me for a coffee because I want them to see how people, even though they are unemployed, but they are still happy and working. What they need is they want to move into the system. They need a support. But again, in a minor, imagine as an African to find a job is a nightmare. Having a crime record with police comes and absolutely impossible. So how do the police help our young to move from the streets of Melbourne into a sort of a productive society? For the police is to consider first now to try to think to take these crime reports out of them. They made this without knowing what the system is. And unless these criminal records moved from these young boys will always remain a crisis for all of us, not only for the people in the streets of Melbourne, but for us as community, as family. We are trying to get these boys to move. So the one thing that we need with police to work now is how do we help the people who are already in this sort of position.
We'll take another question from the floor on crime.
So, as a community, to hear the police say that racial profiling isn't widely practiced is so beyond confusing it's actually bewildering. So, I'd like to ask Mr. Cartwright to actually define what racial profiling is.
I've heard what Burhan said about, I'm not sure I understand about breaking the family. We have laws that we must comply with, and we think kids are at risk, then we need to take action. It's the same with what you're talking about, is why do we pull up African young people as opposed to others. And Burhan has got a valid point about minor offences, but some of the offences that I'm talking about are robberies and serious assaults. These aren't minor offences. These are people seriously injured and are hospitalised, and we have an obligation to act on that. So then I would expect that if we're seeing African young men in gangs robbing people and assaulting them, that the police on the street would need to talk to African young men coming into town in those situations. So that's what we do. Certainly we would be doing in the areas where African young men live, particularly where there's big African communities, then we would be interrogating those people, stopping those people more on the street more than we do others. That's the challenge that we have, that's the challenge the community has. The community expects us to act.
But it's not a legitimate policing practice to have a minority commit a crime and then to criminalise the entire group and be like any black male walking down the street is a potential perpetrator of this crime.
No.
It's just not logical.
No, and that's a reasonable question. But again, if we're seeing groups of African young men committing violent crimes, which is what we've been seeing in the CBD over the last 18 months, then we need to act. That's what we do. And it's a policing practice, it's not a new policing practice, that any group of young men will be stopped and questioned, particularly late at night.
Just because it's not new doesn't mean it's wrong.
No, good point. You're quite right there. But see, one of the things that Darren Hinch asked me the other night was something about African young people being scary. Any group of young people will be scary. Any group of young white men coming down the street will be scary to some people. So the challenge for us is balancing what the community expects us to do in terms of what they're concerned about and what's reasonable for the young people in the street.
But we're part of the community.
Yes,
We're concerned
absolutely.
that we're being stopped and
Yep.
searched. So
Yep.
are our voices being as clearly heard by the police as
Well,
maybe your white
yep.
voice?
That's a good question, and that's a challenge for us all the time. So you're saying to me that we're racially profiling and that we're over-policing you. Other areas of the community will say these kids are creating havoc and you need to do something about it. So we have to balance that pressure.
Me?
Yep.
Thank you. My question is straight to police.
This was going to be your session, Tim. Gets easier after this.
He's got the speaker, so.
Okay, so there was no crime in refugee camps.
No crime in refugee camps. And
So the
also-
question?
And also the question is, what is the problem of the Australian legal system? Why the crime increased as we arrived to the backyard of Australia?
I think that's a very complex question. Bahan, would you like to say something?
Well, if I can put it this way, we're coming from, as I said, a communal society. We care for each other where we were. And I agree with you, I was in the refugee camp myself. To be honest with you, we don't have arms to protect anyone. We have the collective effort of looking after one another. The problem here is we are coming to an individual and institutional society. Individual and institutional society, unfortunately, and I said to myself, I was explaining when I came here, I was in a playing field and this whole society was in a mountain. I start to climb that mountain because I have to understand them, but does everyone go that way? Because we are, and this is part of the crisis, in this humanitarian world, we used to have 13,750 refugees coming here. Nearly 15% of those coming were single mothers, called women at risk. And these women at risk mothers come with little kids. Before they know anything, they get into the Housing Commission. And we know what Housing Commission is. That is from mainstream Australians. It's seen a failed families. A family, you know, I'm not trying to put it in a bad way, but from mainstream, it is seen as a failed families. And I was there myself, living in Fitzroy. The police, when they come to my house, they knock and they straight point to me to come out. Where I live now, they respect me. I'm the same person. But out of the Housing Commission, I feel that I'm a different person. Okay? I was in Fitzroy. I faced so many things when the drug problems was in Fitzroy, in Collingwood, and in Carlton. So my point here is, we are not given chance to learn the law, to learn the system. Our kids, before they knew what the system is, they are in crisis. So, as I said before, if the humanitarian system is to succeed in giving people chance, is to give us an L-plate law system when there is minor issues. The police should not put it in a record of crime, because that stops the life of that young person or young girl or young boy and destroys the future. And we know that. So what we need is, the L-plate is not about big crimes. Any big crime, any crimes that are offense in a bigger manner should be treated like that. But for refugees and for people like from our background, coming from illiterate, no educational background, especially the single mothers coming on a woman at risk, they don't have 21st century social skills. They're not educated. They are coming thinking these are the best society and leaving their kids. If these people can give us money, if these people can treat us this way, giving us house, they must be the best people. They trust, and they leave their kids in the hands. They're out. And what they get? After a few months, they lose their kids. So what I'm saying is, the system has to allow us to have people to learn at least a year, 6 months, whatever period is allowable, that should be given. And that's the only way to break this cycle.
Okay, that's great, Dr. Ahmed. I love the L-plate theme, and I think it's very key to note that once someone's in the system and they've got that criminal record, it's very hard for them to come back. So I think that's a very important point you've made. Unfortunately, we have to move on to topic 2. I could stay on this topic all night. Sorry, ladies and gents, I couldn't get a hand at the start, and now I'm sworn bottom.
I just want to say that the majority of African young people are actually quite successful. the dealings that I had, we have over 1,237 young people, and the majority are very successful, very hardworking, and unfortunately, when crime and young people are reported, then the image that employers and many other groups would take is that that these young people have failed. That is not true. I can tell you that that is not true. That's the first thing. The third thing that I really want to say is, look, it is important to recognize that we are the visible minority. And I support what you said. Quite often, the stop and search is not justified. It's not. There are incidents where young people have to be asked by police officers, and in the majority cases, they actually comply. Now, there was a degree of resistance after the incident in 2009, and there were clashes between police and young people. But I think our young people have come to understand the role and the responsibility of police. In majority of the cases, I believe from what the information that we get, they are actually complying. Now, there are also cases where young people have reported to us the stop and search wasn't justified. One of the things that I really want to recommend is actually a review of that policy. Now, in my discussions with senior police officers, it was clear that the reason why stop and search started in the inner west suburbs of Melbourne is because there was an increased crime rate committed allegedly by African young people. Now, that doesn't justify, and I say that doesn't justify stop and search. If it happens to one group, then it should happen to all other groups. That is my personal view. Now, secondly, there is also evidence that some police officers may not necessarily understand the issues that Burhan and others have touched on, the disadvantages that young people face. I was at a school today at the Western English Language School, where the principal told me if he sent a young African kid and a white kid to a school in the western suburbs of Melbourne, they would take the white kid and they would say, no, the place is full. Now, these are the sort of messages that some of the young people have been hearing for quite some time. It is quite normal to have resistance sometimes to authority. And I guess finally what I really want to say is no one is going to be saying now or for the future that we haven't got a problem. But the problem will be exacerbated, and I have seen it in Sydney, particularly amongst Vietnamese. And if we have more clients coming from the Vietnamese community to our doors, then obviously those problems are protracted because of the way in which we deal with them. The way in which we deal with them should be, as Burhan said, empowering communities, allowing them to participate, and removing the systemic and structural barriers rather than blaming them.
Thanks very much, Absalom. One final question.
Okay, it's not really a question, but I wanted to talk to the team. It's like when you release such things about African being 4 times likely to commit crime, it affects not only those young people who commit crime. I'm not Sudanese, I'm not Somalian. However, those statistics actually affect us from getting employment, getting into schools, or even in the social life. So what about if the police could change or try to release some positive things that African people can do? Because we just don't do commit crime. We are educated, we are graduated, we have PhDs. So if the police can just one day release something about Africans, one thing positive that we contributed to Australian society, that would be very good.
I say again, we try. We try to give good stories like we give the bad stories, but it doesn't always get reported. Doesn't sell newspapers, doesn't sell media. So we certainly try that, and I think we've got more hope of talking about those good stories in local community papers. They're the places that we get those stories published. I agree with you, absolutely. There's lots of positive stories to tell.
All right, we have to finish up on the crime there. Thanks very much for everybody's questions. Move on to our second topic.